A big concept in UCS Manager configuration is this idea of resource pools. We've talked quite a bit at this point about service profiles, and the idea of a service profile is I'm going to assign a bunch of identity points to a service profile that then get mapped to hardware. And a great example of that is MAC addresses, which is why we're covering it as part of network configuration. However, if we were to manually map these identity points, which we're totally capable of doing, UCS Manager will allow us to manually do it, that's not going to really scale out to potentially a dozen MAC addresses on every single service profile, and potentially dozens and dozens of service profiles. I mean, that multiplies out to the point that we don't want to have anything to do with manual mapping of identities. So resource pools are how we're going to solve that problem, and with that, we'll jump in and take a look at how we use them. Let's remember that the concept of a service profile is a software definition of what a server should be. And that software definition includes the identities and the policies that we're going to map to a particular server. Now, this identity concept can really be a little bit harrowing when we think about it, because we've talked about how we might have up to 10 different VNICs and maybe more on our servers, and guess what? Every single VNIC is going to need a MAC address. Well, that's well and good to say that I need to create 10 MAC addresses, but what if I have a lot of service profiles I'm going to be deploying into my environment? The reality is that in most environments, I'm going to have at least 3 to 5 service profiles, even in a really small environment. In really large environments, I might have dozens, if not hundreds, of servers. And so the reality is I need a better way of provisioning all of these identity points, whether they're MAC addresses or IP addresses or something else. And as we said in the intro, the solution to this is going to be the concept of resource pools. Resource pools are going to be, well, exactly what that sounds like. It's going to be a pool of resources. We've got a lot of different types of resource pools that we can create. For example, we might create UUIDs. That would be universally unique identifiers that normally are burned into a motherboard. And yet, as part of a service profile, of course, any identity point, including the UUID, is going to need to be part of our service profile configuration. And then it will replace the burned-in address that exists on the motherboard. Another example would be fiber channel, worldwide node names, and worldwide port names. We'll just call them worldwide names here as an abbreviation. That is another type of resource pool we might want to create. Now, within the networking world, we're going to care a little bit more about MAC addresses and IP addresses. And this is what we're going to cover as part of this video, since this skill is focused on network configuration. But before we drill into the details of a MAC address or an IP address pool, let's talk about resource pools as a concept. The idea here is, once again, I'm going to create a resource pool. It's going to have a bunch of different, let's just say MAC addresses in this case. We've got a lot of different MAC addresses inside this resource pool. Now in UCS Manager, we create a service profile. In the service profile, we're going to create a VNIC. And as part of that VNIC configuration, we're going to point it ideally to a resource pool. I say ideally because we could manually configure it, but as we've talked about, that's really not a good idea. So let's not even consider that as a great option. So we're going to point it to a resource pool, and once the service profile is formally created, it's going to pull down a resource and map it to that VNIC. That resource has now been claimed. We've said that this particular MAC address right there, that's already being used. We can no longer use that MAC address in any other service profile, or more specifically, on any other VNIC. Furthermore, this becomes a permanent part of the service profile. This isn't transient. This isn't a concept that says, well, all right, on today, when we boot up the service profile, it's got this MAC address, but if we were to shut that service profile down and boot it up again tomorrow, it's got a different MAC address. That would not be helpful to anybody. So it is permanent, meaning that whether that service profile is in an upstate or in a downstate, either way, the MAC address is forever part of that VNIC. Now, naturally, if we go in there and we delete the VNIC, then the MAC address would be restored to the resource pool, because at that point, we could use it on a different VNIC somewhere else. Furthermore, if we were to go in and for whatever reason delete this resource pool, well, this permanence still applies. We're not going to go to the service profile and say, hey, I know that you got that MAC address from this resource pool, but that resource pool is gone, so you got to give me that MAC address back. That, again, wouldn't benefit anybody. And so by deleting this resource pool, yeah, okay, all the MAC addresses that are in there we could now put into other resource pools, but the ones that have already been assigned, those are already part of the service profiles, and we're not going to go yank them out of there. Now, that said, if we were to reassign a different resource pool to this VNIC, well, at that point, it would go out and we'd secure a new MAC address. Furthermore, if for any reason we went out and we deleted the VNIC and recreated it, or we were to delete the service profile and recreate it, either way, at that point, it's going to go back out to the resource pool. And, well, again, this pool that we used before, this is now deleted, so we're going to go out to the new resource pool, whatever that is, and grab a new address. So it's permanent as long as we don't make changes to anything, and most importantly, I suppose, as part of that, as long as we don't get into the VNIC and reassign it to a different resource pool. If we do that, then it will go out and get a new MAC address or whatever other identity that we're attaching to. Now, one other important concept within the world of UCS management is this idea of multi-tenancy. We haven't actually addressed this yet, at least as part of the DCCOR course, if you're working your way through that. And this is the first time we're going to hear about it, but I promise you it will not be the last. The idea of multi-tenancy is that I can have a root organization, and this comes configured by default within UCS Manager, and I can create service profiles if I want to, service profile 1, service profile 2. But if I wanted to, I could also create an organization. This organization might be, I don't know, let's just call it human resources. So I've got a different organization, and now I can create resources under it. I could create service profiles. I could create also, by the way, resource pools. And then furthermore, underneath that organization, I could create another organization. We would call this a sub-organization. And we can continue this path to create more and more sub-organizations if we so choose, and have resource pools and service profiles at every level. Now, why do I bring this up? Well, because when we are going out, and our service profile, for example, needs to go to a resource pool to grab a resource, there's a possibility that this resource pool is empty. And if it's empty, UCS Manager doesn't actually give up. For example, let's say we're part of this organization down here, and we are creating a new service profile, and therefore we're going to point it to this resource pool. And let's just say that this resource pool is named Mac-pool. So we point at this point, I suppose, a VNIC towards this resource pool and say, okay, grab a MAC address from Mac pool, and it finds out, hey, you know what? This is problematic because there are no more MAC addresses inside that resource pool. But again, UCS Manager doesn't give up. It's going to check the higher level organization, in other words, the parent organization, to see if there's a resource pool that exists with the exact same name. If there is a resource pool with the name Mac-pool, then it will pull a resource from there. And it will continue going all the way up until we're at the root layer. And if there's a resource pool at the root layer called Mac-pool, then it can grab a MAC address from there. Now, it's worth pointing out, I suppose, that if as part of this root organization, we have two different organizations, let's say this one down here is called sales, at this point, we're not going to go over to a different organization because it's not part of our tree. It's not a parent organization to my original org. That's the whole point of multi-tenancy, is that we can have separate tenants that are independent from one another. However, a sub-organization within a different organization, well, at that point, we're considered to be all part of the same global organization, and ultimately, we're all part of the root organization. So the first step, and this was, believe it or not, one step, the first step is to start our organization, go all the way up to root, looking for the exact same name. However, even if we go all the way through those checks and we still don't have a MAC address, we're not done because there is a second step. We're going to go back to the original organization and we're going to check for the default pool. As part of every organization's configuration, we can configure a default MAC address pool, a default IP address pool. In many cases, these defaults are already configured within UCS Manager. And so we just have to go in there and we have to add the MAC addresses. So whether we've done that or not, we're going to go back to the base organization down here, and we're going to check for the default. If we don't find the default, we're going to go to the parent organization, check it for a default. And we go all the way up through all of the parent organizations until we get back to the root, looking for a MAC address that exists in a default pool. If at that point we don't have any MAC addresses, then I'm sorry to say it, but we are done. We've done our due diligence. We are simply going to have to flag an error that says, hey, we are not able to bring this VNIC up because we don't have a MAC address to assign to it. So let's talk about these two types of pools we want to discuss in this video. First of all, we have the idea of a MAC address pool. We're going to create a MAC address pool and give it a name. We can have as many MAC address pools within an organization as we desire, so we can configure different names for different situations. However, even within a MAC pool, we can have multiple blocks, so plural blocks, of MAC addresses. So I could create one string of MAC addresses, and I could create a different string of MAC addresses if I so chose. We always define the starting MAC address as part of any particular block, and then from there we assign the number of MAC addresses. So we don't provide the full range, we simply say, hey, I want to start with 0.0.0.0.0.1, and I want 15 of these. So it would go from 1 to 15 at that point, which would be, by the way, F. Now that said, we probably don't want to start with a MAC address that's actually all zeros. Cisco gives us a recommended OUI, an organizationally unique identifier, which consists of the first 24 bits of a MAC address, which also maps to the first 3 octets. And so the OUI that Cisco recommends we start with is 0025B5. This has been reserved by Cisco for UCS applications. Unfortunately for us, as we'll see when we log in and configure a MAC pool, it provides this for us and says, hey, you should really use this, so we don't have to have this memorized from a configuration perspective, although we might need it for the exam. But at the same time, we don't have to use it either. We can define our own OUI if we want to for whatever reason, but our goal here is to ensure the uniqueness of our MAC addresses. Now from here, we still have the remaining 3 octets to provide, and we can pick whatever we want there. Generally speaking, by the way, I would recommend we do something like this, where we have a MAC pool for fabric A and a MAC pool for fabric B. And at this point, we can assign the organizationally unique identifier there of 0025B5. And then from there, we could say that this octet is representative of the fabric. So I can maybe say A1, or possibly even AA if I only need 1 block in that fabric. And then this entire range in here can be used for the MAC addresses that will be used on that fabric. This provides, by the way, 65,000 different addresses just with those last 4 octets that are remaining. And so hopefully that's enough, but if it's not, then hey, we can again go with A1 and A2 and such as separate blocks. Similarly, we can do the same thing with B. We can replace the AA with BB, and then when we're looking at our upstream LAN, maybe we get onto our Nexus 9K switch and we're looking at the CAM table and we see MAC addresses that have AA in it or BB, then we know exactly where it's coming from. We know it's part of the UCS domain, not only from that, but also from the OUI we're using, but then we can also even tell which fabric it came in on. That's just one way where we can use the dynamic nature of UCS as well as the customization options of service profiles to have some fun in our environment and give us better visibility into what's happening. Now, with all this to say, again, I want to re-emphasize this uniqueness concept, because if we have multiple instances of UCS Manager inside of a layer 2 domain, which should only really happen in very large scale environments, but hey, it's absolutely possible. We've got 2 pairs of fabric interconnects here, we've got 2 pairs of fabric interconnects there, and they're all part of the same layer 2 domain. Then we have to be very careful to make sure that our MAC addresses do not overlap. At that point, we probably would want to change the OUI in one of those domains to be something else. But again, we've got to be very careful to make sure that we're not leveraging an OUI that we shouldn't really be using, just if nothing else, for the sake of creating duplicate MAC addresses in our infrastructure. So that's MAC addresses. What about IP addresses? Well, from an IP address perspective, we're not going to be pushing IP addresses all the way down into the virtual layer. In other words, our VMs are going to be configured at the hypervisor layer. And so really, why do we need IP addresses in UCS? Well, the main reason we need IP addresses is going to be manageability. We need management addresses in our environment, and furthermore, we need a management address not only for every service profile, but for every physical server. That means that if we have 8 servers and 8 service profiles, that we need 16 IP addresses. But if we also have, by the way, 8 service profiles that are active on 8 servers, but then we also have another, let's just say 4 service profiles that are inactive, well, those actually keep their IP address even when they're not active, just like our VNICs keep their MAC addresses when they're not active. And so therefore, in this environment, we would need 12 IP addresses plus the 8 for the server, so that would be 20. Now, as part of the default configuration, Cisco creates a management IP address pool for us for this particular application. Just like the MAC addresses, we're going to use the concept of blocks. However, in this case, the blocks don't only consist of the start of the IP address and the amount of IP addresses we need, but it's also going to include the default gateway configuration as well as our DNS servers. So we'll say DNS1 and DNS2. That'd be our primary and secondary DNS servers. Now, the default pool that Cisco gives us for this as part of the UCS configuration is called ext-mgmt for external management. If we configure a block of IP addresses in the external management pool, it's going to automatically map an IP address to every physical server in the environment. At that point, we can continue to add IP addresses to be used for our service profiles, or we can create a separate IP pool for using in the service profiles themselves. These IP addresses are going to be used for KVM over IP, meaning that we can actually connect to the KVM management of a server over IP. We don't have to go to the server and physically connect up anymore. We can do this all remotely. It's one of the beautiful parts of the ways that we manage the UCS environment. So as we saw in this session, the service profiles are going to take advantage of these resource pools for identity management. We've got a lot of these different points of identities, whether it's MAC addresses or IP addresses or UUIDs. We're going to use the resource pools in order to distribute those to our service profiles. Now, when we're creating a MAC pool, we get to define several blocks of MAC addresses. We only need to create 1 block. And keep in mind that Cisco provides us that OUI that we probably should use in our environment to make sure that we're not overlapping with other MAC addresses that are outside the UCS domain. There's nothing to say that we can't change it, but we better make sure we know what we're doing if we do. And lastly, when it comes to management IP addresses, we need to keep in mind that every physical server needs an IP address, as well as every service profile. And the physical hardware is going to automatically pull from that external management pool. Meanwhile, the service profiles, we can go in there and we can specify a different pool if we so desire. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.